So let me start this way, Craig. You're an author, an editor, television producer, book coach. So where did all this begin? Where did this whole process begin?
Where did it begin? I think it began when I was in grade school. And I was over at my best friend's house, and there was a picture magazine. Maybe it was Life or Look, something like that. And it showed what would happen, the story, if a nuclear bomb exploded on Times Square. And I realized that my father's office was about 4 blocks away. Not a good place to be. And I think that was the start of an interest in war and peace, which is threaded through my whole life. I was one of the people who thought this was a nuclear war had a very tiny chance of happening, but if it happened, it would be so devastating that you don't want to take any chance.
Did you come from a family of literary people or professional people?
My father was an electrical engineer, and my mother wanted to be an artist when she was in high school. But unlike the boys in her family who went to college, it was enough for a girl to go to high school and learn typing, I guess, and you could become a typist or a nurse. And so she had the plan to go to the Bauhaus because her family had originally in the 19th century come from Germany. And her parents didn't think it was proper for a young woman to travel alone to a foreign country, or otherwise she would have been studying with people like Klee and Kandinsky and Gropius. But this never happened. So it's not a literary family, to answer your question, at all, although in my siblings' generation, it's become a literary family because all 4 of us have done books in the last couple of years.
How would you describe your family as a group? Were they a highly educated family? Except for your mother didn't go to Bauhaus, but she must have been.
No, not highly educated. My father was raised on a farm in southern Minnesota, and he and his brother went to the University of Minnesota, and he became an engineer, and his brother became a geneticist. So that was the education in that generation. My mother declared that her daughters, if any, and her sons, and there were 2 of each, were all going to go to college. And if they wanted to graduate school, I don't know how they managed. I think it was a lot cheaper in those days. Is how. But I would describe it as a close-knit family. And I've heard the joke that the American ideal is to have a close-knit family maybe 2,000 or 3,000 miles away. But we've been, actually all my siblings are in Ashland now, with which we had no relationship before, 16 years ago.
So where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Milwaukee, and I'm very pleased to be from the Midwest. But at the age of 4, I think, my father went to the New York office of his company, which made electrical switches. And so I grew up in the suburbs of New York. And my mother was like kind of an immigrant to New York from the Midwest. It's like the big city, you know. It's a different kind of culture.
So where did you go to school? Give me some of your education background.
I went to a really unknown prep school for high school called Concordia Prep. It was a prep school run by the Lutheran Church. My parents were both Lutheran. And then to Harvard College and a bunch of schools after that. I didn't know quite what I wanted to do. So I went to a year of law school at Yale and went to MIT, political science, and then to Stanford, and a made-up degree, which was about social imagination. And So I kind of was a proto-academic. And then when I was about 40 years old, a published author, a highly paid consultant, my whole life fell apart. I mean, which has happened to a lot of people. Divorce, my father had dementia, went into dementia. I went back to graduate school, my thesis advisor died, and I had a road accident. And it was wonderful because I had a chance to start over. And I didn't know quite what I wanted to do, but gradually became a book creation coach, working with clients who wanted to write their own books. And so I met a succession of wonderful people and heard about their ideas and material a couple years before the public. It was great.
You mentioned at one time that you were the editor of the Harvard Crimson, wasn't that what you were? Tell me.
Well, yeah, but don't hold it against me. I mean,
Talk to me about that.
that was a long time ago. It was so exciting because we had a linotype machine in those days. There was no desktop publishing. And when I would go to bed late at night, I would hear the little linotype slugs falling down the rails. It was a great adventure with wonderful people around the newsroom, wonderful colleagues in those days. So I had a chance to write and meet amazing people who would come to Cambridge to speak. I remember Willy Brandt once, before he was Chancellor of Germany, before he was mayor of West Berlin even, came to talk, and it felt very natural to have him to dinner with a few friends in the house, and he was very polite, and, with college kids. I mean, it can't have been all that interesting for him. But the Crimson opened a lot of doors.
Talk to me about Pravda.
Excuse me?
Talk to me about Pravda.
About?
Pravda, the Russian newspaper, Pravda, Truth.
Ah, Truth. There's a Russian saying, there is no truth in Pravda, and there is no news in Izvestia, which means news, I guess. In the 80s, a man named Don Carlson and I had lunch. I think he wanted to do a book. And so I viewed him as a potential client. And he said, you haven't had any experience setting up foundations, have you? And I told him the truth. I said, I don't know anything about it at all. And he said, well, good, how soon can you start? Because I wanted to set up a foundation. He was a multimillionaire. And, I'll say as much in the background as is wise and will help out as much as is necessary. And so we had the one task for the foundation of helping to end the Cold War, which seemed impossible. And he said, Craig, I know it's impossible, but it's necessary. Well, I was completely sold. Somebody like that. So we collaborated on a couple books about ending the Cold War and supported, I think about 30 groups, foundations, and others who were working in citizen diplomacy. So it's a great opportunity.
Did you work with the government, the U.S. government?
No, not at all. The whole idea of citizen diplomacy was to work with people who were not officials. And we were quite critical of the governments because we thought they were very good at running the Cold War, really quite skillful on both sides. Didn't have a clue how to end it until Gorbachev came along. I was puzzled by Gorbachev for years. Every day I would read the news and ask myself, does he know what he's doing? Or is he just trying to reinvigorate the Soviet system? and this is all happening accidentally? Or was it a plan? And I would go back and forth, and I'm still reading now. I'm reading about the end of the Cold War this week and finding out a lot of stuff. But we had unusual access as Americans in those days. We're talking about the 1980s now, because they hadn't seen any unofficial Americans, or many. So I was able to talk, for example, with Fyodor Berlovsky, who had been at Khrushchev's elbow during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the messages came in and Khrushchev was wondering what to send back, Berlovsky was advising him. The two of us had coffee in Moscow, and he told me about the Cuban Missile Crisis from the Russian side. He told me some things that U.S. intelligence didn't know. For example, the Soviets had brought tactical nuclear weapons, including warheads, to Cuba to repel an invasion. And at the time, the U.S. was practicing a naval invasion off the Dominican Republic. So we were very close to nuclear war. I mean, it didn't happen because Khrushchev pulled back and turned the ships around. And all Dean Rusk could think to say was, I think we were eyeball to eyeball and the other fellow just blinked. Well, I'm glad he blinked. So Gorbachev, you asked about, I think he wanted, well, he certainly wanted a new relationship with the West, and especially the United States, partly in order to work on the domestic politics of the Soviet Union. But he was very impressed by Euro-communism, and he was a loyal communist. But what kind of communist? A communist who was very like a social democrat. Some of his friends in Europe had been like social democrats, and so he wanted a very different system where the Soviet Union would not impose on Eastern Europe, but let them work out their own fate, country by country. And he wanted an arms control agreement with the United States. The U.S. Authorities very reasonably wondered whether Gorbachev really meant it, or whether this was just the usual propaganda in a new form. And so it took a while. They had the Geneva summit and then the Reykjavik summit. I was in Reykjavik for that summit by accident because I'd arranged to go there and made hotel reservations, and then the summit was declared, and all the hotel reservations were canceled because they had to bring the staff from the American side and the Russian side, the Soviet side. And so I arranged to stay with someone at the University of Iceland, a graduate student who helped me out during my visit. So those are the citizen diplomacy days. When I retired to Ashland, the first thing I did was work with a Zen meditation teacher. I didn't know what is retirement. And so this is something I had never done before. I'd never done anything, quote, spiritual. And so I worked with him and then gradually started writing articles for the internet, for Huffington Post, Alternet, this kind of thing. And started this TV show because here in Ashland we have public access, community access television, which I think is great. And so I've had my hands full. I never have been so busy as during retirement.
Tell me about what you've learned working on public access television. You started off as a neophyte, Now, how many shows have you done?
I think I'm still a neophyte after about 100 shows, half-hour episodes. My trick was that I never prepared questions. I always just asked something, obvious, and then listened, and to the guest. And the only trick of the show besides that was getting good guests, people who could talk, and trying to establish an informal atmosphere. Don't look at the cameras, look at me, kind of thing. So what I discovered was the basis in doing the show is a basis of a lively community, which I think Ashland is. And the trick of it is social invention. I mean, we're full of social inventions here. And people are attracted by that. Whether it's, aging in place at Mountain Meadows or the many voluntary organizations in the community. There's no shortage of guests. In fact, I planned to do a dozen shows, and then people started saying, "Oh, you have to call so-and-so." Well, I did, and then they would say, "Call so-and-so," and on it went.
Your life seems to have been one of meeting interesting people.
I've really met a lot of interesting people by accident. I mean, when I was in college, another dinner we had was with a visiting Danish author called Isaac Dinesen, who had written Out of Africa, as you know. And I was attracted to her writing, I think for kind of romantic reasons, going off to Kenya, colonial Kenya, and having a coffee farm. And she was friends with this aviator who flew over the Serengeti plain. And it was all wonderful. But I realized that a lot of her writing was about very dark things. And Seven Gothic Tales and so on. And I said this at the dinner, and she said, and mind you, at that point, she was an older woman. She said, "Young man, you can stand anything if you can make a story of it."
Tell me a little bit about working in Chicago.
I went to Chicago after spending a year in Tunisia with my the wife, and I worked for Time magazine, just as the very low man on the totem pole. And as that junior member of the staff, I got weekend duty the first weekend of the summer. Well, race riot in Chicago. And so I had to cover this thing. They pulled the cover of the magazine. It was going to be about the Chicago riots, and I had to report it. And I knew the way from my apartment to the office, but I hadn't yet established contacts and so on. I found somebody from the area where the riot occurred, and we went out in a car together, and he didn't know left and right, the words left and right. He would say, "This way turn," or "That way turn." So this was and I got, it was like being thrown into the deep end of a swimming pool when you don't know how to swim. It was wonderful. And so I enjoyed that summer. Among my beats were the Playgirl or Playboy Mansion. Hugh Hefner started in Chicago before he went out to Hollywood. And so it was a lovely time.
Are you still looking for that perfect?
The perfect wave? I've read a lot. In fact, my wife Shoshana says that my tombstone should read, Craig Comstock, he read a lot. But it's not the worst thing. It's pretty harmless and not all that expensive. I mean, it takes time to read. So I've been not a proto-academic, but I've liked words. But my in this time of my life falling apart, to put it dramatically, I deliberately took up painting because I'd never done any images since kindergarten. And those were images that only a mother would save, and she did. So I wanted to exercise the right side of the brain, do something I didn't know how to do at all. And so I did a picture a week for a year. I mean, big. And they were just, like any first year art student at best.
Did you save any of them?
I saved them after I threw away the first ones. They're all long gone, but the last ones were not totally bad, and so I did save them. Yeah.
You came to Ashland.
Yeah.
Why? What brought you here?
I came to Ashland because my mother was living in the Bay Area at the time and wanted to escape the tremendous squalor of the Bay Area, and so I volunteered to take her up to Roseburg, where she had an adopted sister living. And she decided not to move to Roseburg. She was in her 80s at the time. It seemed natural to her to move to a new community. But on the way back, it was getting dark, and so we stopped here in Ashland. And just to spend the night and not have to drive at night. And the next day, she totally fell in love with Ashland, as you know, it happens. And Ursula Le Guin was appearing at SOU that night, I remember, talking about her new translation of the Tao Te Ching with an improvisatory musician on the stage with her. And we went to the Bricks and, I don't know, probably saw some Shakespeare. And the next day she bought a condo. And then all her 4 children moved to Ashland at different times.
They're all still here.
And they're all still here. We, as humans, make up stories about our life so they make sense, like writing a resume is an extreme example of that. But a lot of things happen by accident. We meet people by accident that we turn out to be very close to. And a lot is accidental. It's not bad. And I feel that way about my life, that there have been a lot of happy accidents. In my 20s, I had a lot of unhappy accidents where, for a moment, I wasn't sure that I wouldn't be really hurt and maybe killed. One involved climbing on a 5th-story roof. Another involved an avalanche in Austria, where I saw the avalanche beginning, realized what it was, but I didn't know where it would come down. And so I didn't know whether to run that way or that way. And so I just stood and put my jacket over my head, and the snow grew more and more dense, and then less and less. It cleared and there was blue sky. So it was an interesting 30 seconds or so. And that was an accident too.
Yeah.
I mean, why was I there? I don't know. I'm 76. On my 75th birthday, I spent the whole day writing a letter that I intended to be 1 page and turned out to be 10 or 12. It was a letter of gratitude. Gratitude about my life. I think that we've been in a very fortunate generation, kind of after World War II, not involved in the Vietnam War, and not involved in any of our subsequent wars. And it's been prosperous. We've had various kinds of forms of freedom. It's been wonderful. A wonderfulness that is not shared by most people in the world. So I just give thanks for that, and feel that most of the accidents in my life have been happy ones, and happy ones, some of which have allowed me to contribute in a small way to not making the world a worse place.
It seems to be very important. To me, that's very important.
That's important, yeah.
So this is, I know you don't plan things, or you don't say you don't plan things. So what's next?
What's next? Well, I'm working on a book, because the world really needs more books.
Yeah.
And this book is called Venturing Out, and it's about enlarging your comfort zone deliberately. That's something that you've done. So when you get to a place of where you're at all bored, or you're attracted by something that maybe you once wanted to do, or you've newly discovered it, you go through a phase of awkwardness. So, of course, one wants, framing a single comfort zone is a tremendous achievement, because it means you can operate there. You know what to do. So why leave it? It's fine with me if people stay in the first comfort zone they have, as a college student, say, or a young person. But if you want to go out, you have to go through this period of awkwardness, at least I did, and risk looking like a fool. Something I've managed to do repeatedly. And like starting the television show. And what did I know? Nothing. And you gradually learn, and it's fun to do. And you can make a little contribution. The contribution of that show was just giving people doing admirable things a chance to talk.
It's about not being afraid.
It's about being afraid, but not being afraid to be afraid.
I like the phrase you use about being willing to look like a fool.
Now, my first client was Vicki Noble, and she talked a lot about fools, because she had drawn a tarot deck, and one of the cards is the Fool. Now, I had always thought in my ignorance that the Fool was a critical term. Oh, you're a fool. Or you're a Shakespearean fool, so you speak truth to power. But she taught me that that the fool is the person who begins stuff. It jumps off the cliff in the card. Or in Buddhist terms, beginner's mind. So she said, well, you're really a fool. And it took me a little while to get used to it, but it was the beginning of a perfect friendship.
Tell me a little bit more about your relationship with Buddhism.
I had no relation with Buddhism until I came to Ashland in my 60s. And don't call myself a Buddhist because, well, the part of Buddhism that I really like is like Stephen Batchelor, who calls himself an agnostic Buddhist. One doesn't, I'm not critical of other people's belief, but that's the side that appeals to me. I think the Buddha is quoted as saying, he was asked about the afterlife, and he said, well, let's talk about something serious, something we can know about. And he was never drawn into like theological discussions. So I had the good fortune to have a really wonderful meditation teacher, and we met every morning here in Ashland at dawn in a little sangha. And during the sangha, there was always what's called dokusan, meeting with the teacher where he could ask you questions or vice versa. And so my relation was in old age. And a special form of Buddhism, not, I think, what most Tibetan Buddhists, for example, believe in reincarnation and so forth. And I don't know quite what it reincarnates because there's no self. But something does. And so mainly it was a form of mental training, of quieting the mind for me. And I had a very noisy mind, as you can imagine. So my meditation teacher once said, watch the candle in the middle of the circle and count how many times it flickers. So I'm looking at the candle, I'm very nervous, of course, and 1, 2, 3. And I realized I'm not, he wanted me to do this for half an hour, say. And I realized I couldn't count this, and I got very tense, and then I realized it was a koan, because Rinzai Zen teaches through koans. And so the half hour ended, and he said, well, how many times did it flicker? And I said, it flickered once, over and over.
He didn't whack you with a stick then, did he?
Yeah, right. Right. And one day, it was just dawn over those hills in the east, and a haiku, a triple haiku, came to me on his front porch, looking at a ridge in the winter. It was powder on Dawn Ridge, the bell, a way that silence has of ringing us. Us, rung by silence, soon you'll be telling me sun rises, snow melts. There's nothing to be distracted from when birds fly in the sky. That was what I went in with. I don't know where it came from.
You talked about when you were working at the Harvard Crimson as the editor. You'd go to sleep, you could still hear the linotype machine dropping the slugs down the slots.
Yeah, the clicky click.
You write for Huffington Post now, totally different.
Yeah, and when I worked for the ARC Foundation, which was in the 80s, I've talked about that, about citizen diplomacy, the man who gave the money, named Don Carlson, suggested that I do some freelance articles. And so I wrote, for a year, freelance articles for, I don't know, the Christian Science Monitor or other publications, about the Soviet Union and about citizen diplomacy. That was wonderful. So I've dipped into journalism at different times in my life. And I have a real love of, a respect for investigative journalists, people who tell it like it is.
So do you see, in terms of media, do you see a difference in, say, comparatively to Huffington Post as compared to, say, writing for the Christian Science Monitor in the old days?
Yeah, the difference is that you have an editor at some place, a periodical. Huffington Post doesn't edit. They decide either to take the thing or not. And I don't know, I've had about 80 articles published. So they must think it's okay. But they don't edit.
They don't edit. So that's the difference. What about in terms of delivery? The media is no longer being sent to you in a newspaper, and now it's
Yeah. Well, I guess my little TV show is part of that, of getting away from words. And I've noticed on the internet, there's more and more video embedded instead of articles, or the articles are shorter. It's like, read, oh my God, where's the video?
That's very true.
So, and I like both forms. Insofar as I even understand, what to do on video. On like, wow, I like to come in with my hair standing up, which did very easily when I had more of it. And I'd read about all the news anchors with their hairspray, and so I was sort of the anti-television person.
That's great. Yeah.
I looked like Bernie Sanders in the old days. Well, I should be so lucky. Huh?
Politics a little bit, just quickly.
What's that?
Politics a little bit. Is it different than now than it was, say, 4 years ago?
You know, when I was in college, JFK was the big thing, especially in Massachusetts. He was a senator then. And he led the fight to get out of the National Defense Education Act a McCarthyite loyalty affidavit, which was ridiculous. I mean, anybody who was disloyal would sign it right away. But it was it was obviously unconstitutional, at least in those days of the Warren Court, because it was vague, you know, and it asked for your beliefs, not actions, and so forth. But Kennedy said, well, Congress has made this mistake. Let them correct it. Don't wait for the Supreme Court to do it. So I wrote a thing, and he wrote a foreword for it. What was it called? Worse than futile. Futile, not futile. And we sent it around to college presidents and heads of newspapers around the country. And they got rid of the affidavit. It was the end of McCarthyism. I mean, that is what caused the end, but that was the last gasp of McCarthyism. And so I admired Kennedy and went on the 1960 campaign. In fact, for a week, the penultimate week of the campaign, and suggested to him that he propose a national program of youth service abroad, which became the Peace Corps. I mean, he had the courage to do this during the campaign. It might have ended very badly. It didn't. And I guess the Peace Corps is still running, a half century or more later, under Republican as well as Democratic administrations. So politics for me started with Kennedy, who I know had various sides, as did his brother Bobby even more. And I've kind of followed politics, but never felt comfortable in Washington. I never wanted to be in politics. I don't think I'd be very good at it. If I can do anything, it's think about the future, you know. And
so how do you see politics today?
Desperate. I'm desperate about it because it's not healthy for one of our two parties to be in denial about science. I was raised in a kind of a Republican family. My father, as I've said, is an engineer. My brother was a businessman. He started a business. I'm not hostile to those values, but denying stuff because it's really inconvenient is very bad. It's going to turn out very badly, and it's a burden on our country. I don't know. They'll probably say when climate change becomes obvious, if it isn't already, mistakes were made by somebody else, and go on.
Well, I noticed that you drink mostly tea.
I drink mostly tea, except on Friday afternoons I have a mocha club with my brother, because my brother, most of his adult life, he lived across the country, and even though we grew up in the same room, I realized I didn't know him anymore. So we started the Smoker Club Friday at 3. We don't have to make the arrangement, it happens every week. And that's the only coffee I drink, and it's half chocolate and not much. So Dennis, you can pick which kind of tea you want. What kind do you would you like? No, it isn't. Oh yeah, it is. Well, yeah, it is.